felt it the moment I stepped inside Hollow Creek Mall, an uneasy chill that slithered down my spine and settled deep in my bones. This was only my second week working the night shift, and already I was beginning to regret it. But I needed the job, and the mall's security team didn't ask too many questions, which suited me just fine. As I walked my rounds, the weak beam of my flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows that blanketed the deserted corridors. Once, Hollow Creek had been the pride of our small town, but now it was a decaying shell of what it had once been. Most of the stores had shut down over a year ago, leaving behind an eerie silence that stretched on for hours. I paused at the food court for a quick break, dropping into one of the cracked plastic chairs. That's when I heard it. Just the faintest sound, like something scratching at glass. I straightened, listening harder, but the noise stopped almost as soon as it started. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing more than the building settling, but a knot of unease tightened in my chest. Something felt off. Glancing at my watch, I saw it was 2 a.m., 3 more hours to go. I stood and scanned the area with my flashlight. The beam swept over the empty tables, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. As I moved to leave, the noise came again, louder this time, a rhythmic tapping echoing from the far end of the mall. My pulse quickened. The doors were locked. No one else should be here. I hesitated for a moment before heading toward the sound, my steps careful and deliberate. Each footstep seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls in the unnatural silence. The tapping grew louder, sharper. It was coming from the direction of an old toy store at the far edge of the mall, one of the few places that still had some merchandise left behind. As I approached, I saw it. The front window of the toy store cracked. Spiderweb fractures snaked across the glass, distorting the view inside. But it wasn't the cracked window that stopped me cold. It was the shadow on the other side, a human-shaped figure perfectly still, standing in the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice low and cautious. The shadow didn't respond. It didn't even move. I swallowed hard, gripping my flashlight a little tighter as I took a step closer. That's when I saw them. More shadows, slowly emerging from the dark corners of the store. At first, it was just 2. Then 3. Then 5. All of them standing motionless behind the cracked glass, their faces hidden in the darkness, their forms unnervingly still. A shiver crawled up my spine, and I took a step back. I reached for my radio, my fingers trembling, but before I could call for backup, a whisper brushed against my ear, so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. "You shouldn't be here." I whipped around, flashlight sweeping the empty corridor. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, like eyes pressing into me from all sides. My throat went dry, and I slowly turned back to the toy store. The shadows were gone, but the door was open. The toy store's door, which had been shut just moments ago, was now ajar, creaking open ever so slightly as if beckoning me to step inside. Darkness pooled beyond the threshold, thick and impenetrable. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I was frozen in place, my mind spinning with questions. What was happening here? The air grew colder, and the soft sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere deep within the store. Then something moved. Another figure stepped out of the shadows. It was taller, its features pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared directly at me. It stood in the doorway, head tilting at a strange, unnatural angle, lips curling into a wide, unsettling grin that stretched far too wide across its face. "Why don't you join us?" it whispered, its voice low and raspy, as if it hadn't been used in years. My blood turned to ice. I stepped back, heart pounding, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, smiling, watching me with eyes that seemed to pulse with malevolent hunger. Suddenly, I heard it again. The faint scratching, this time from directly behind me. I spun around, flashlight flickering, but again, there was nothing there. The cold pressed in tighter, and I could feel eyes on me, more than just the single figure. They were everywhere now, unseen but suffocating in their presence. I bolted. I sprinted down the corridor, my breath ragged in my throat, the sound of soft footsteps trailing after me. I didn't dare look back, couldn't bear to see whatever was following me. But I heard them, the echoes of footsteps, twisted and distorted, growing louder and louder as I ran. I reached the main entrance and slammed my fist against the glass door, desperate to get out, but it didn't budge. The mall was sealed tight, trapping me in this nightmare. The footsteps stopped. The air grew still. Slowly, I turned around. At the far end of the corridor, they stood, dozens of them, the faceless figures, motionless, waiting. The figure from the toy store stood at the front, still smiling, its head slowly tilting as if curious. Then the lights flickered and went out, plunging the mall into absolute darkness. And then, just behind me, a soft tap, tap, tap on the glass. What do you think really happened in the hollow depths of that mall? Was it a ghost of the past, or something much darker lurking in the shadows? Maybe you've had a moment where you felt someone was watching you, or worse. I'd love to hear your thoughts or your own chilling experiences, so drop them in the comments below. And if that sent a shiver down your spine, hold tight. Our next story, The Watcher in the Walls, will dive into even more terrifying mysteries. Trust me, this is one tale you won't want to miss. When I first moved into the apartment, it seemed perfect. A cozy, affordable one-bedroom in the heart of the city, just far enough from downtown to avoid the noise, but close enough to still feel connected. The landlord was an older man, quiet but polite, with an unsettling calmness about him. He didn't ask many questions, which was exactly what I wanted. The first night was uneventful, but on the second night I noticed something strange, the feeling of being watched. At first, I thought it was just the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling, but this was different. It wasn't a random noise. It was rhythmic, deliberate. It began around midnight, a faint shuffling sound like slow footsteps, but muffled as if coming from inside the walls. I lay in bed, holding my breath, listening. The noise moved from the living room toward my bedroom, the steps slow and methodical. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a neighbor. Old buildings like this had thin walls, and sounds carried easily. But when I mentioned it to the landlord the next day, he gave me a strange look. "There's no one on either side of you," he said flatly. "Those units are empty." A chill ran through me. That night, I went to bed early, telling myself it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The apartment felt different, like it was waiting for something. And then, around midnight, the noise started again. But this time, it was louder, closer, like something was moving right behind the walls. I sat up, heart racing as I heard it, breathing, heavy, labored breathing. It sounded like someone was standing just inches away from me, hidden behind the plaster. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The moment the light hit the walls, the sound stopped. The room fell silent, but the feeling of being watched remained, a suffocating weight pressing down on me. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I tried to rationalize it. I was tired. Maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with this place. That night, determined to prove it was nothing, I inspected the walls, running my hands along the plaster, checking for cracks or signs of movement. Everything seemed normal until I reached the far corner of the living room. There, at eye level, was a small hole, no bigger than a dime. It looked like it had been drilled deliberately. My heart skipped a beat. I crouched down, peering into the hole, expecting to see insulation or pipes. But instead, I saw something else. An eye. Something was staring back at me. I stumbled backward, a wave of nausea washing over me. My mind raced. Who, or what, was watching me from inside the walls? Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and called the landlord. My hands shook as I explained what I'd seen, but his reaction unnerved me even more. He didn't seem surprised. His voice was calm, too calm. "I'll be right over," he said. 15 minutes later, he arrived. He wasn't carrying any tools, no ladder, nothing to fix the hole. Instead, he walked straight to the corner of the room, crouched down, and looked through the hole himself. His expression was unreadable as he stood up and turned to face me. "What did you see?" I asked, my voice trembling. He stared at me for a moment before speaking. "This building's old," he said, his tone unnervingly flat. "A lot of things have happened here over the years, things people forget or choose not to remember." I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest as he walked toward the door. "I'd recommend moving out," he said over his shoulder. "Some things don't like being watched back." He left without another word, leaving me standing there, cold dread creeping up my spine. I should have left that night. I should have packed my bags and never looked back. But instead, I stayed, too stunned and terrified to make a move. That night, the noises returned, but they were different now, more aggressive. The shuffling was louder, faster, like something was pacing frantically behind the walls. And then came the scratching, low, insistent, as if something was clawing at the inside of the plaster, trying to get out. I grabbed my phone, hands trembling, and shone the flashlight toward the hole in the wall. My blood ran cold. The hole was bigger now, wider than before, like it had been slowly widening when I wasn't looking. And from the other side, I could hear it. Something shifting, moving. I stood frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and the hole continued to widen before my eyes. I could see movement now. Something was pressing against the plaster from the other side, distorting the wall. Finally, I snapped out of it. I bolted for the door, not bothering to pack, leaving everything behind. I ran down the stairs and out into the cold night air, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't stop until I was far from the building, drenched in sweat, my mind reeling. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I swear I can still hear the scratching. And I wonder if whatever was in the walls has finally made its way out. If you want to see more horror stories, check out my next video.